Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Guy Harrington. I am the CEO of Hood Education. We would like to welcome you to the International Dyslexia Association's webinar series featuring Dr. Patricia Mathis. Dr. Mathis is the Texas Instruments Chair of Evidence-Based Education and Professor of Teaching and Learning at Southern Methodist University. She is also currently the Editor-in-Chief of the Annals of Dyslexia and also the founder of Hood Education. Today's webinar will last between 45 and 60 minutes. It will be an interactive session. We ask that you send any questions that you have through the Q&A feature at the bottom tab of the webinar. During the time allotted, if we have time, we will get to as many questions as possible. We will pause Dr. Mathis' presentation in order to ask and answer a question. So please submit those, and I will be your moderator today to take care of any questions you may have. At the end of the presentation, we will be recording this session with Dr. Mathis. It will also be posted within the next week on the International Dyslexia Association's website, as well as on hoodeducation.com. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce your presenter today, Dr. Patricia Mathis.
Hello, everybody. We've got an echo. All right, so we're going to talk today about what is possible in terms of curing dyslexia. And please notice that we have a big question mark after the title, suggesting that we're not saying you can absolutely cure, but we do want to know what is possible towards having students that no longer experience severe reading problems. So we're going to go through what we know in terms of the research, looking at brain research as well as intervention research. We'll look at what interventions have been shown to be highly effective and the ages at which we get the best effects for these kids. Before we begin, I like to always share a little bit about myself, that I come by my knowledge about kids with dyslexia quite honestly, because I myself was a child who struggled to learn to read and eventually was labeled as dyslexic. Eventually they gave me the title as gifted dyslexic, which of course I prefer. But I was a child who struggled, and my mother was out there advocating for me back in the days before there were even special services. So to all the parents out there, keep up the hard work. You're the person that makes the difference for your child, as well as the teachers, all working together as a team. Okay, so let's talk about the causes of poor reading. And much of the knowledge of what we're going to talk about today is probably already known to many of you, but I'm not going to assume that all of this knowledge is known to everyone. So if I'm repeating things that you already know, I apologize, but I want to make sure that I'm not leaving anybody behind in terms of our knowledge base. So the question is, what causes poor reading? Well, it turns out that there are a multitude of reasons, and it's a combination of reasons why children have reading problems. The first is that there really are neurological or brain-based differences for these kids, and we're going to take a look at some images of children's brains that have and do not have reading difficulties. We also know that reading problems run in families. So if you are a child of a parent who struggled to learn to read, you are much more likely to have problems yourself. Now, those may be related to genetic problems, which in dyslexia we know there's a definite genetic link. It may be that your family is economically disadvantaged, which puts you at risk. It may be related to linguistic diversity. It may be that you have a combination of these issues, and of course the more issues you have as a child, the more likely you are to come up with problems. Now, neurological and familial problems are things that schools don't have that much control over, and obviously if it's genetic, it's genetic. However, we also know that probably one of the largest reasons why kids have problems learning to read is instructional issues. The instruction that they receive does not match their needs. I call this dyslexia. That's not necessarily a professional word, or it's not a word that is widely used, but I see this happening often in the schools where children need specific kinds of instruction and it is not provided, in those kids then struggle. And we probably have a combination where there may be a genetic predisposition and then the instruction doesn't meet the needs, and now you have dyslexia combined with dyslexia, and that can be disastrous for kids. So let's look at the genetic factors. In terms of genetics, we know that there have been identified a multitude of different chromosomal sites. And I'm not going to go through this as if all of you are medical doctors. Those of you who are will understand this more. But the bottom line about chromosomes is that we haven't actually identified the dyslexia chromosome, the dyslexia gene. We do know that different kids have different issues in different sites, but two children may not express the same genetic or chromosomal differences. So what that means is that there is no one specific gene for poor reading. However, having said that, we also know that about 50% of the variability in what explains children who struggle to learn to read is explained by genetic factors. We just don't quite at this point in our history understand how those genetics really work out. And importantly, perhaps it's not so important we understand the genetic factors as much as it's important that we understand the environmental factors. Because, and this is one of the big points of the talk, that we can control what happens in the environment. We have no control of the genetic factors that kids bring to the table. But what we know is that based on what the environment that children are being raised in and instructed in accounts for about 50% of how strongly or how severely a reading problem may or may not be expressed. There's a word in medicine that is often used called epigenetics. It's actually a burgeoning field within in the medical world. And epigenetics is all about what environmental issues flip on or suppress genetic or chromosomal factors. In other words, you take twins, you put them in different environments. They have the same genetic predisposition for the same sets of issues. One environment may flip on a gene and the other environment may not. Or the environment may reduce how severely a predisposition is for something, or another environment may exacerbate, enhance or increase the likelihood of that occurring. Why is this important? Well, my goodness, if we understand the environmental factors that create or enhance the likelihood that dyslexia will be increased or suppressed, we want to do whatever we can to make sure that those genetic factors that the child brings to us, we have no control over that part, that we're enhancing the likelihood that that genetic predisposition for having reading problems is suppressed. And we in the schools, and also in our homes, parents and teachers together can create environments that can ensure that children that have a predisposition for dyslexia, now we're talking about small children, in other words, before they've really expressed the phenotype being expressed as for dyslexia, we can have a huge impact on what that looks like. So again, genetics predispose a child to dyslexia. But it does not absolutely mean that that child will absolutely have an expression of dyslexia, depending on what happens in the environment when the child is young. So that genetic predisposition, what we now understand about dyslexia, is really a predisposition for not figuring out easily how words work. So dyslexia ultimately is a disposition for not understanding how the code of language, how the speech of language codes onto the print of language. For whatever reason, and it is genetic, their brains are just not predisposed to this. However, the environment, as I said, determines how severely children will experience the dyslexia. And it turns out, and this is what is so hopeful for all of us that work with these kids, it turns out that instruction is the most important environmental factor. I think that's really good news for all of us, because if we can get children the instruction they require if they have this genetic predisposition, we can greatly reduce how severely that child will express dyslexia. Now, before I go much further I want us to also think about dyslexia as not being an all or nothing kind of situation. It's not like you have a child who is or is not dyslexia or dyslexic. It turns out, and this is widely understood now, that dyslexia really is a condition much like high blood pressure or weight or overweightness that is really on a continuum. And so you can have a child that has a genetic predisposition for dyslexia, who gets an environment that supports those needs, who may demonstrate some level of dyslexia, but is on the lower end of the continuum. Whereas another child who maybe comes with the exact same genetic or similar genetic package, who doesn't get their needs, may slide over on that continuum and have more severe problems. So we know that the environment is determining where on this dyslexia continuum a child fits. And at some point, we're going to say that as a child with dyslexia slides over and looks more and more normal, that at some point we're going to say they're normal enough. They look good enough. They're performing pretty much like other kids who never had these genetic issues. So we're going to call those kids, quote unquote, cured. Now, you and I may understand that there is no such thing as a true cure for this, because those children may have, some ongoing spelling issues or organizational issues, but they're performing pretty normally and they perform well and they're doing okay in school. We're going to call those kids are in the cured category, even though they probably need ongoing supports, and we've got to keep a good eye on them as they go up through the grades. So what we're really talking about here is neuroplasticity. And for everyone out there that provides instruction to these kids, I want you to understand that what you do with these children is so much more than what any neurologist or, the doctor of neurology and such could do, because it turns out that the way we intervene with these children is through instruction, and we change their brains. Because it turns out that reading is not a natural process. All of us who work with kids with dyslexia understand it. These kids don't pick it up naturally. Many children do seem to pick up reading fairly naturally, or at least they figure out how things are working without, they probably all need some level of instruction, but clearly kids who do not have issues learn it fairly easily. And that looks to be about 40% or so of our kids, or actually about 60% of our kids, appear to read fairly easily with some instruction, and it doesn't even have to be fabulous instruction for many of these kids. Dyslexic kids, not so. Their instruction has to be fantastic in order for them to really get it. So reading is not a natural process, actually, for anybody, and for our kids, it is really not natural. And it's not constructed as a result of simple exposure. That belief is still a belief in the schools today, that somehow if you just expose children to good literature and read to them a lot and read them bedtime stories and have literature-rich environments, that the kids will just naturally learn to read. And that may be true for some kids that have a natural predisposition to understand how this phonetic code works and maps onto print, but it's not true for our kids. And many parents who have kids with dyslexia who have read to them every night and done all the things the school said, and their kids still are not reading, and we end up almost blaming the parents when they've been raised in these literature-rich environments. We know the kids, that proves that it's not natural for everyone. So that's one point when schools are saying we want literature-rich environments. We do want literature-rich environments. We do want all those things for kids, but that's not enough for the kids who have dyslexia. And that's a really important thing for all schools to understand, because in some places, schools of education are still teaching teachers that it is just a natural process. It's a language process that kids will just pick up. And that can just, if that is a belief system that our teachers are coming in with, not special ed teachers typically, but your general ed teachers, that may be what they were taught coming into the schools, those teachers are not going to be prepared for the kind of kids who don't pick this stuff up naturally or just through exposure. It turns out that the process of learning to read actually rewrites the organization of the brain. And so the brain is a very plastic organism, and as we teach kids to learn to read, their brains learn how to operate with this information. The kids with dyslexia have brains that have to be carefully taught how to use this information. So it also turns out that the structure and the transparency of the language interacts with how the brain learns to recognize words. Now, what do I mean by transparency? Well, some languages, like Spanish, have a very easy to recognize code between the way sounds are printed and the way they are said. So in other words, in Spanish, there are 5 vowels, and there are actually only 5 vowels, meaning that the letters each represent one sound, and only one sound, and there's not a lot of tricks. And when you put 2 of them together, they each make different sounds. They're not making a vowel team. Whereas in English, we would say English is an opaque language because there's a lot of, well, it's just a trickier language. So in English, we tell children there's 5 vowels, but actually those 5 vowels make 10 sounds just written one as one, because they all have a long and a short. And of course, long and short don't mean anything. It's not like you say the vowel longer or shorter because it has something to do with the sound. That's just what we call it. And then we have these things called digraphs, and where you put, or vowel teams where you put them together. Now it's a different vowel. And oh, by the way, that sound, sometimes it's said this way and sometimes it's said this other way. It's opaque. It's confusing. And so kids with dyslexia tend to have greater expression in English and in French, it turns out, but we're going to focus on English today, than in other languages that are more transparent, because the brain basically has more work to do. It has to figure out more rules about how the language is working. And so kids tend to, or children have greater difficulty in English. That means teachers who are teaching reading in English really have to have a deep understanding of the structure of our language down to the phoneme and the syllable level. And that becomes a problem because in many places, our teachers don't really have that knowledge. I think our dyslexia teachers do have that knowledge, excuse me, and that's part of what sets dyslexia teachers apart from general education teachers. But we do need general ed and dyslexia and special education teachers all working together as a unit to make sure that the environment we're creating for these kids as a whole counteracts whatever genetic predisposition they bring to the table. So this is why I think teachers who work with kids with dyslexia really need to be paid a whole lot more, because it turns out what we're doing is very brain-based, and there isn't a neurologist on the face of the earth that can do for these kids what we can do. There is no pill. There is no magic trick here. It is getting the instruction these kids need. So let's take a look at what we know about the brain structure about children with dyslexia. And so I'm going to share with you work that I actually was doing back in the days when I was at University of Texas in Houston at the medical school. And at that time, I was working with Jack Fletcher and Barbara Foreman in a group that was working with magnetoencephalography, also known as a MEG scan. And so we were taking children and putting them into our MEG scan and then putting them in an fMRI, and we put those two things together and we're able to look at what's going on in the brain. And we were doing this work about a decade ago. And so the knowledge that I'm getting ready to share with you has been around for actually a little over a decade. As I share this with you, I want to also share with you that the work I'm sharing has been replicated in that time frame. So I'm going to show you scans from work we did back in the, a decade ago. But know that it's been only supported. Then you see other people's work done out of Harvard and other places, that the Yale studies that only confirm the work that we were doing. The question we were asking at the time, and so now we know the answers to this now, but at the time we were asking, when children with dyslexia learn to read, because obviously lots of kids with dyslexia learn to read. I, for one, am an example of a child who did indeed learn to read, even though it struggled in the beginning. The question is that brain creating compensatory structures, or is the brain actually normalizing? Is the brain of a dyslexic child who learns to read, does it continue to look different, more like a person who's had a stroke that creates compensatory mechanisms, or does the brain normalize? Now, the question you might be asking was, well, who really cares? But it turns out that compensatory mechanisms are typically never as good. When the brain normalizes, what you get is, well, normal behavior, normal functioning. When it's compensatory, think of someone like who's learned to speak again after having a stroke. They may still struggle with vocal language or whatever the issues are, even though they are functioning. Often the functioning is not as good. So we want normalization. But when we were doing this work, we had no idea if you could actually normalize, or if we can, normalize the brain. So let's take a look. So here's what it looks like when we have kids who are normal readers. So first we got to know what normal readers look like. And at this point in our history, we have had thousands of children who have had brain images by different groups. And what we see again and again and again and again and again is brains that look pretty much like the brains you see in front of you at the moment. That in normal readers, and these are the scans of the brains that we have on right now, are of children that were about 3rd grade, so they're actually reading. What you see is that in a normal reader, you have lots of activation on the left hemisphere. I'm not going to go into all the mechanisms of the brain, but you see this strong activation on the left and just a little activation on the right. Now, what you get on the brain is, on the right hemisphere is the visual cortex. You're getting information in visually, and then it's transferred over to the left hemisphere of the brain, which is where language comprehension ultimately occurs. And so this shows a brain that's getting visual information, and then it's going over to the left hemisphere, and it's being processed for language comprehension. Take a look at the brain of a child with dyslexia. This particular child's brain is really not activating at all. There's a little visual, and then you see the left hemisphere has very little activation. You can see that the parts of the brain seem to know something's supposed to happen here, so we see some activation, but clearly it's not what it's supposed to be. Now, we asked the question, can we look at children who are very young? So these are 5-year-olds, the brains of 2 children who were 5 at the time of the scans. And that means that they haven't learned to read yet. These scans were done in kindergarten before they were being taught formally how to read. They were probably working on phonemic awareness and some prerequisites that lead up to reading, but they had not had formal reading instruction yet. What I think is very interesting is in the child of the brain who is normal, which is the child on the right-hand side of your screen, even though this child is not reading, the child is probably reading some words at this point, but not reading, extremely well. He's only 5. You see that clear left hemispheric activation. It's perhaps not as strong as what you saw on the previous slide of the normal child, because all the networks haven't yet been established, but the child, that brain clearly knows what to do with this information. We've got a little right hemisphere information, which is coming in off the visual side, and then we have all the activation on the left where it's supposed to be. Look at the child who's at risk. We have very little left hemispheric activity. And this is of a child who is not yet considered dyslexic because, well, they haven't been taught to read yet. They haven't failed yet. So all we can say right now is that this child is at risk, perhaps, for developing dyslexia, but is not yet considered dyslexic. The right hemisphere of the brain, which is where the visual information is primarily coming in, is going crazy. Doesn't know what to do with this information. Now, I should back up and share that the task these children were given were simply looking at letters and being asked to tell what the letter the sound of the letter was. So just a very beginning level of reading task. And what you see for the at-risk child is the visual. This is what you would expect if you showed a picture of a triangle to somebody. It's just a visual information, but there's no phonetic or language connected to it. So it's interesting to see that clearly there's some differences going on in these brains. I say this because, I mean, I think the brain information really proves to us that there is truly a difference between children who demonstrate that they are going to be or have become dyslexic. And for those naysayers, and there are naysayers out there who want to say dyslexia is a fragment of, or figment of our imaginations, it doesn't really exist, and there is a faction out there that really doesn't believe that there is such a thing. Here's the evidence. Let's put it before trial. A jury, I think the jury would come back with like, well, their brains sure look different, so there must be something different going on. And like I said, we do have genetic evidence as well, but the brains are not activating. The brains of these children are not activating. It's the same. Do we have a question?
Dr. Mathis, Jill asks, how do we know if the brain differences are inherent to dyslexia or due to lack of reading experience?
Jill, that is an extremely good question. And so what we know is that when we take children who have risk factors, which may include, so when we give kids like asking them just to hear sounds within words, children who have been raised in environments where they haven't experienced those activities will still often or typically be, if they don't have any risk factors, be able to tell you that they can hear a p at the beginning of pat, or let's say, or k at the beginning of a cat. They even though they haven't had lots of experiences, their brain naturally is hearing some of these sounds or elements. And their brains may look more like they're at risk because they've had less experience, but at the same time, there's going to be more activation on the left. When kids, and we're going to talk about how assessments we commonly give in the schools actually do give us some pretty good clues. It is also true that just because you come from a poor environment does not mean you are not also dyslexic. And sometimes we assume that that it's an either or. And so sometimes we have kids, if you're from a poor environment and haven't had lots of experiences with language, and then also have a genetic predisposition, you're going to, it's very hard to disentangle that. So at the bottom line is we know that children whose left hemisphere is not activating, those are the children that are going to show up as having severe reading problems. So I'm going to take that as an indicator that there is dyslexia. Are we ever going to be able to completely disentangle who is dyslexic versus who is having other issues related to economic and familial issues? No. And that's because they're always going to be tangled. Okay.
So Jill had a follow-up question asking, how is the at-risk group defined? By letter reading ability or by the scan?
So that's a good question about this study. So the question she's asking is, how did we identify risk? And actually later in this presentation, I have a list of the kinds of assessments that identify a child as at risk for having dyslexia. And of course, our goal is to ensure that those children never know they are at risk for dyslexia, so it doesn't express itself. But the kinds of tasks that we were asking these children to do, so they were identified as at risk based on the same kinds of assessments that we commonly do in school, primarily things like letter knowledge and phonemic awareness kinds of tasks. When children score low, very, very low on those tasks, even in kindergarten, we know they're at risk. When we go and look at their brains, we then see that those children scoring at risk on the kinds of assessments we give typically in schools actually do have different hemispheric activity in their brains. So their brains are not if they've had exposure, their brains aren't processing that information. I would say by kindergarten, it's very rare to have a child who has had no experience with language, especially in our schools over the last 15 years or so, where the kind of instruction, that it's common for kids to get lots of exposure to alliteration and first sound, phonemic awareness kinds of activities, phonemic and letter knowledge work, even in kindergarten. But these kids aren't, the kids we're talking about are the kids that are not benefiting from that more typical instruction and showing up as at risk. We did do this study in the second semester of kindergarten, so we knew that all children had some exposure to the kind of general instruction that kids typically get in kindergarten and respond to. Okay, so now the question becomes, we've identified kids, we've said that they do look different, that just with your typical classroom instruction, they are not responding like they should or would expect them to. And maybe they've gotten what they needed at home, maybe they've not, but we know that they've been at least exposed at some level. The question then becomes, what happens when we get in there and really intervene with these kids? And this is the exciting part. I get really excited about this work because you look at the genetics and you look at the brains and you're like, oh my gosh, it's a done deal. Actually not. It's not a done deal. What we know is that these children bring with them challenges to the classroom. They have greater needs than other typical developing children who don't bring dyslexia with them genetically or don't have that predisposition. But when they get the kind of intervention, and we're talking intensive intervention, the kind of things that we do with dyslexic kids, the kinds of things you get when you're doing your structured language instruction, that their brains normalize. So what you're looking at on this screen is the brain of the same child before an intervention was done and after an intervention was done. And in this particular study, there are a number of studies that have been done for different time periods, but this particular study, the intervention time period was about 16 weeks of intervention. So between when the brain scans were done. So you can see that before intervention that we have very little activation going on in the left hemisphere, just like you expect, and overactivation in the right hemisphere. So the brain seizes information, knows it's supposed to do something with it, doesn't know exactly how to process it. So you see overactivation in the right and not enough in the left. But here's the exciting part. What we see is when we teach children how to process the information about print and how words work, even in English, which is trickier, as we've mentioned, we see that the right hemisphere calms down a little bit. It's now processing just the visual pieces that it really needs to, and it comes over to the left hemisphere, and we see what we consider normalization. So what we see is that intervention is normalizing, creating the brain structures in these children's brains so that their brains are now functioning in a normal fashion. It is not a compensatory manner, it is normal. Now, what we also see is that when we do this with very young children, what you'll see is that they then look normal, like are able to function in reading at levels that are normal with their peers. And the reason for that is they haven't had the chance to fall behind. So when we get in there and intervene and normalize their brains, so the brains know how to function and process words, they then aren't falling behind in vocabulary and aren't falling behind in background knowledge that you gain through reading. And so their brains are now processing information normally, and they continue to behave in a normal way in comparison to their peers, even though they may still have some other issues such as, just a little disorganization and some spelling issues that continue. They may also be, but for the most part, they can look very normal. The question then comes up about older children. Do you get, because this was, what I've just shared with you were children who we intervened with we did their brains in kindergarten, we intervened in first grade, and then we looked at how the interventions looked, and their brains were normalizing. And by 33 weeks, we were just getting outrageously good activation. In fact, the neurologist came and said, "What are you doing with these kids?" They're like super lighting. We have another question.
Yes, Dr. Mathis. Sherry asks, 16 weeks later, how many hours in 1 week for the interventions? And I have a follow-up.
All right. So, and I don't want to get stuck on one specific intervention, because we now know that there's not the one intervention. There are I'm going to talk about the characteristics of interventions that have been proven to be very effective. But in this particular study, what we were doing was providing 45 minutes daily. And we actually did it for a total of 33 weeks, which was most of the school year. This particular brain image was taken at midpoint. So we did a beginning, middle, and end. And so I'm showing you the midpoint images, which is about 16 weeks or so. 45 minutes every day, with a highly trained, highly expert, and also highly mentored teacher working in a small group of 3. That's what this particular image was were from. Now I'm going to move to, go ahead.
One more question, Dr. Mathis. Judith asks, by what age does intervention have to take place for the possibility of normalization?
All right, now see, you've gotten to the crux of the whole presentation. Age matters, and age matters a lot. So in terms of normalization, I'm going to go to the next slide, and I'm answering, you've actually asked the question that I'm getting ready to present. So I'm going to continue through the presentation, and then I think the question about age will be answered. So when we look at activation patterns with older children, and so now I'm sharing the work of a group that is out of Tufts and out of Harvard. What we see is that children that are older, and I think the children that we're looking at here are about 5th grade. And I can show you brains children in 7th and 8th grade that look very similar. I mean, there's been a number of studies now that show these same kind of findings over and over. We could just spend an hour look at 8th graders, they change. Look at 9th graders, they change. Look at 7th graders, they change. What we see is that when we teach children who have this genetic predisposition for not processing words or figuring out how the word process really works, that when they get that knowledge and we make their brains practice through daily intervention, that the brains of older children do indeed normalize in terms of how they're processing words. So in terms of teaching the brain how to process the information, there isn't really an age limit. That's really good news. The problem, of course, is that if you're taking a 7th grader and they're just now learning how to read words, and most typically with the older kids, they get stuck at the multisyllabics. We get them through like your basic CVC or single syllable words, and then they get stuck at those multisyllabics. If they're just now at 7th grade unlocking that knowledge and their brains are processing, what happens with those kids is they've got a gap, because their peers have been reading and gaining background knowledge and increasing vocabulary knowledge since the beginning. And now these children are finally getting on the bandwagon and able to do that, but now there's the steepness of the growth that they have to make in these other areas to look normal can become, well, essentially impossible. So catching up with the other areas of knowledge can be extremely difficult. And their brains are still learning how to process more and more complex words, whereas the brains of these other children have had more time. So it's not that they don't normalize, it's that they're just behind. They're behind in the race. The other kids got off the starting blocks long before they did, and they're still having to go through the same sequence. So yes, they normalize in terms of where activation occurs, but their knowledge base will be behind. So it does matter how old these kids are. So this gets at the importance of intervention.
Dr. Mathis,
yeah.
Beth asks, there's also the factor of RAN difficulty with dyslexia. How does this instruction increase RAN?
Aha, okay, so RAN, rapid automatic naming, and what rapid automatic, I'm being disfluent or having a little aphasia or something. RAN, or rapid automatic naming tasks, are actually an early indicator of fluency. And if you look at this slide, you'll notice that I'm talking about ongoing latency issues for these kids. So those children who demonstrate early RAN problems And so what we know in dyslexia is if you have a child who has phonemic awareness, and then you attach with that also RAN difficulties, which is an indicator of latency problems. They're not processing information as fast. Those kids are more likely to have more problems. What we found with intervention is that what you include in that information has a big impact. Many interventions with learning with kids with dyslexia really focus on how words work, which of course they should, but often don't focus on fluency. And so in other words, we'll give kids as much time as they need to figure out the words. And kids who have RAN difficulties or these ongoing processing speed issues, it turns out that they need to be pushed to process faster, and that the brain can learn to process faster. And so that's something that we really want to look at in our interventions, that are we not only teaching the content, but are we asking kids to do it a little faster, do it a little faster. And of course, it's much like learning, like practicing for track or anything else. We get a little faster a little bit at a time. So it turns out that those interventions that have early fluency drill work, like saying the names of sounds that you've learned and doing it faster, saying it fast, reading words, saying them out, saying them faster, actually increase the likelihood that those kids will function in a more normal way. It does appear that this latency issue, which is what you see in a RAN task, may be one of the most distinguishing features of those kids who have more severe dyslexia. So when we look at the brain images of kids, we will see that they normalize in terms of the location, but that these latency issues, in other words, the speed at which they're processing the information they know, may continue to be a challenge for them. Hence, this is maybe one of the more important things that we've learned, that it's not okay to let kids take as much time as they need to figure out things, that we have to push them a little bit to go a little faster. And that work actually does help the brain, that latency speed up. Even with that latency work, that speed work, they may still have some issues there. But again, at some point you're fluent enough, you look okay. So the issue is not do they become absolutely normal, but do they get to a point where they're good enough? And we find that with interventions, when we start young, that we can get them good enough. With the older kids, the latency issues tend to be more severe. In other words, they didn't get that practice. And it may be that they're just so far behind that it takes more time for them to look faster. Their peers are way ahead of the game in terms of their fluency, and so they may look more just fluent, and those latency issues may appear to be more severe with the older kids.
We have a couple of follow-up questions.
Okay.
What if RAN is a problem without the double deficit of phonemic awareness issues? Is their dyslexia still more severe?
Because this whole the truth is we don't really understand how the double deficit versus RAN versus just phonemic awareness pieces really work together. We do know that children with dysfluency, you may be a child who's dysfluent that can learn to read words, but and that's not really considered, well, it's a fluency problem, but it's not considered so much dyslexia. I think we have to take the children with the issues that we get and work on. If we really have a child who's hearing the sounds, figuring out how to read the words, but doing it very slowly, then you hone in on the fluency work, which is what you're picking up with RAN. I would also say that it's fairly rare to have a child who is only RAN, that typically you get this constellation. Occasionally you'll see kids who have true just RAN issues. And that's an indicator that you have a child with processing speed issues, because it is what you're picking up there is how quickly they can name things that they already know. It is important to make sure that they actually know the names of the letters or the objects or the colors that you're asking them to say fast. And once you have that assurance that they actually do know whatever it is you're asking them to say fast, if they can't do it very fast, then you're dealing with a child with processing speed issues, and obviously you're going to then hone in on working on that. In the same way, a person who starts swimming, doesn't swim very well, can get faster and better over time. The same is true of a child who is dysfluent and maybe has a genetic predisposition for not doing that very well. There's a processing speed. They can get faster if pushed. Pushed in a nice way.
And is there a test for latency? And if so, which one is best?
Well, RAN is what you test. That's how you determine that there's this, when I say latency, just the speed, processing speed. So RAN is probably your best indicator. Before a child is reading connected text, the best predictor of dysfluency, which is that speed at which they can process information, is RAN. So RAN is your best indicator. Any more questions, or should we good to go? Okay, I'm going to go on. All right, so we've already said this, that it turns out that age matters a lot. That when we start working with children when they're young, they will have better overall outcomes. Because those children that have that genetic predisposition for dyslexia will respond very positively to the scientifically validated interventions, and I'm going to talk about what those elements look like in just a little bit. It is, like I've already said, older children also respond very well to these interventions, but when they're young, you can prevent that child having failure experiences. And it's the prevention of failure that sets apart the children that look like they never had dyslexia versus those children who now carry with them the weight that and the cascade of issues that come along with that failure. And that failure occurs in first grade and only accelerates from there. So we're really talking about trying to intervene with these kids in pre-K, K, and first grade. If we can get children where they need to be by the end of first grade, our goal would be to have every second grader in the world reading and no second grader knowing that they actually had a predisposition for dyslexia. That's my goal in life, to make sure that every second grader is reading. By second and third grade, they're already experiencing failure. So once that child experiences failure, then you start adding on a whole host of other issues. You have the social emotional problems. And it's not just that they feel stupid, but often their peers will start making fun of them, and then you get into, I'm not a good person and people don't like me. And I can tell you in my own personal experience, having been one of the children that did experience failure and did not know how to read at the end of first grade, the problems that I personally experienced were not so much the academic issues. I certainly faced those, but it was the teasing and being made fun of and the social emotional issues that came with that were really the big problem. I like to share with people, and of course this is a safe audience. Now, I have a Ph.D. now from Vanderbilt, so I feel like it's good to say that I overcame these issues. But by fifth grade, I wasn't going to school. I was hiding under my bed every day when my mother went off to work. I was supposed to ride my little bicycle to school, but instead I would ride it around to the back alley, hide it, climb in my window, hide under the bed, and when my mother came in to check that everything was gone, like the windows were locked and whatever, I was under the bed until she went to work. And I did that many days, and because it was so painful to go to school. And so, for some of these kids, I have to say, they're some of the bravest kids I know. And it's not the dyslexia that's the big problem. It's all the other issues that come with it. And then those kids are missing learning opportunities. We know that the majority of vocabulary learning that occurs for children, the way they learn about their world is through text, it's through reading, it's through wide reading. There's no way that a teacher or a parent can teach a child everything they need to know, or that they can experience, especially vocabulary. And so it turns out that not being able to read brings with it this whole cascade of other issues. And it's not just that they can't read their biology textbook, they don't have the vocabulary knowledge often now to do what they need to do for these other subject areas. And of course, the children begin to believe that they're no good. They have lowered expectations of themselves, and perhaps most upsettingly, the lowered expectations of principals and other teachers in the building. And that can be devastating, because if we don't expect our children to grow and do well, they typically live up to our expectations. And then, of course, I know I'm speaking to the choir here, but once a child is behind, it's exceedingly difficult to catch them up with their peers because their peers are on a normal track and that track is pretty steep. And so if you're coming in behind and now you're saying this kid who's behind has to up their track just to catch up, you know, when they weren't making it before, their trajectory of growth was below the normal trajectory. Now it's got to steepen up to catch up. You can see that can be an extremely difficult situation.
Dr. Mathis, once a student has received these instructional interventions, will they regress once the instruction stops?
What we know, so the answer is it depends. and it appears to depend on the child. Well, we don't absolutely have an answer at this point. We know that when children, so in the study we did with our children who were kindergartner and first grader, we started with them just looking at them in kindergarten and intervened in first grade. At the end of that study, the average standard score for the children in our intervention was around 112. So the average we had, if you look at a distribution, the mean and the upper end of the kids were performing almost a standard deviation or above normal on our reading measures. But in that distribution, we had kids that we considered no longer, quote unquote, at risk, who were scoring. We said you weren't at risk if you were at the 30th percentile or above. As we looked at those kids that were getting near the cusp of the 30th percentile, so they're in that normal range, you know, we're looking at standard scores of like 92 or so. Those kids that were on the edge, in other words, they hadn't moved up. Now, understand that many of these kids started our study with scores so low we couldn't even measure them. So you know, they'd made significant growth, but they were still the most significantly at risk on that continuum. And they were doing better. We had actually 0 kids that made no growth. We had 100% responders, but the kids that were on the lower edge of that distribution, I think we can safely say they needed continued supports to continue growing. Whereas those kids that were on the upper end of the distribution, many of them, and in fact, virtually all of them, if they were, you know, coming out of first grade, performing above grade expectations, which many of them did, over 50% of our sample did, those kids were good to go. So the answer is, it depends on the child. And those children that, for whatever reason, and we will never understand exactly all the reasons, it's probably a combination of they came from home environments that didn't support language, plus they had genetic predisposition for issues. Maybe it's, you know, we know they got the instruction they needed in kindergarten, they made huge growth, but they still weren't, you know, as high as maybe kids who were getting more supports at home. Or, I mean, we don't really understand the whys between why one set of kids did fabulously well and other kids did actually pretty fabulously well now too, but they weren't as far. So we got to look at the kids in front of us and understand that there will always be some kids that are going to continue to need supports, but the intensity of those supports doesn't be as heavy once they get that. In kindergarten and first grade, we were doing very intensive interventions every day with highly masterful teachers. In second and third grade, they needed continued supports, but it wasn't as intense. Yes, we have another question.
Yes, I'm going to combine these two. Carrie and Jennifer ask, Carrie states that our state law requires that all K-1 students are screened for phonemic awareness, letter sound correspondence, rapid naming, family history of reading difficulties to identify children who are at risk for dyslexia.
Excellent.
Would a child need to be at risk on all 4 measures to be determined to be at risk for dyslexia, or is there a particular combination of 2 or 3 of them that would provide the best indicator of risk? Followed up by Jennifer's question, if so, what assessments do you recommend to start getting a child diagnosed?
Okay, I think in a few slides I'm going to have a list of measures, of types of measures, not specific names of measures, but the skills that they assess. And my guess is what you've just described, which was phonemic awareness. Can you go through that list again?
Yes, phonemic awareness, letter sound correspondence, rapid naming, and a family history of dyslexia or reading difficulties.
Okay, so of those, and we're talking about kindergarten, I'm assuming, because these would be appropriate measures for pre-K as well, but kindergarten.
K1.
Okay, in first grade, you want to add actual reading. You want to have word reading in that list. But in kindergarten, phonemic awareness knowledge, in RAN, those 2 are probably the most predictive in are they learning, well, letter knowledge. Letter knowledge, RAN, and phonemic awareness are highly predictive with or without familial issues. Okay, so if the home environment does or does not support, I mean, we want to know that, because if they've got a home environment that is supportive of language learning and literacy learning, we'll probably be even more successful. But a child can come from a very supportive environment and still have dyslexia. So it shouldn't be used as an indicator of dyslexia. However, it does give us some information of the level of challenge we may be facing. So so in terms of identifying those kids, keep that home information to understand the level of challenge, but not to determine if the child is or is not dyslexic, because you can be dyslexic from a family that does and does not support literacy development. Also, when we talk about risk, remember that we're not saying that every child that we identify as being at risk actually is dyslexic. And often we can't determine who those children are until we start working with them. And what we'll find is those children who are not truly dyslexic, when we start intervening, the interventions are actually very effective for all kids. You're not harming any child by putting them into these interventions. So if they have these risk factors, get them into intervention. Those children that don't have the genetic component really just have the social, familial issues. What you'll see is this rocket ship growth, because there's nothing going on other than they haven't had the instruction before. And often you can't, we as researchers have often talked about, like, I don't know who's dyslexic until I work with them. And I'm not going to go scanning their brains, because that's hugely expensive. And quite frankly, the intervention is going to be good for everybody. So you're not doing any harm to anybody by getting them intervention. What you will see is the need to regroup these kids pretty quickly as you're moving through. So early intervention is the key to preventing dyslexia from expressing itself. It is also the key to having all literacy problems from expressing themselves. So even if a child is not genetically, neurologically predestined to be dyslexic, if that child comes from a home that hasn't supported, and maybe their parents don't read because they never got the instruction, intervention is still the key for those kids too. So we do now understand that when interventions occur, and that those are intensive interventions, so in a multi-tiered system of intervention, we're talking about interventions that look more than what is traditionally talked about as a level 2 intervention. So we want every level to look good, but we're really talking about an intervention that's outside of special education, but really looks more like what we talk about as tier 3. And I'm really talking about sort of skipping tier 2, just going right to tier 3. And when I say tier 3, I mean that you're working not just with your general education teacher who's trying to shore up a difficulty area, which is in a small group, in addition to the core, which is what tier 2 usually looks like. Tier 3 means you're really working with an interventionist who's highly expert, who really understands how to deliver this instruction, and that it's happening on a daily basis. And it probably needs to occur 30 to 45 minutes every day. And so in most places, depending on the model that's being implemented, if they're doing a tiered model, that usually looks more like what we think of as a tier 3 model. Of course, we can call it tier 2 if, I'm not really so concerned about what your districts are calling it, but the level of intensity and the level of expertise of the people delivering these interventions has to be pretty strong. And then we also need to make sure that what's happening in that core and the other kinds of instruction that child is getting is not working at crosshairs. And we have seen, in some of our studies, we have seen where the intervention is teaching kids to, sound through words and how the letters really work. And then they get into the classroom and they're really being taught to use more context clues and more guessing strategies for figuring out words. And those two things can actually confound or confuse the child. And sometimes that can cause issues. So there is a need to make sure that core instruction and the interventions these children are getting, they don't have to be 100% in line, but the basic methodology and the message the kids are getting need to be aligned. Now we also know that once these children, when they're very young, show up with these issues, they may be performing at very normal levels and looking like we have avoided failure And that's fabulous. But we always need, as they track up the grades, we're going to need to keep our eye on these kids, because they sometimes show up, especially if they have these latency issues. They may show up as they were learning to read words and they looked okay at the end of first grade, but maybe their fluency wasn't keeping par in second, third, and fourth, and that starts falling behind. Or they may continue to struggle primarily with spelling. Although if we really teach them how the words work, they can use that spelling, encoding and decoding are really flips of one another. And so when we teach children how the language of, how English really works, we'll stick with English, their spelling can be pretty darn good. But they still show up there. I always like to point out to people, though, when they think, well, these kids have spelling problems. It's like, have you met any children that don't have spelling problems? I run into gifted kids all the time. That's partly because we're not really teaching in our general ed curriculum typically how the English language at a phoneme and syllable and morphographic level really works for kids. So they're trying to figure it out, and they often don't. But our kids and everybody else's kids often look pretty similar as they grade up in terms of their spelling. Our children with dyslexia often have executive functioning issues as well, and so they may have some organizational issues. So we got to keep track of them. But if we can get them through that first hump of first grade, there's no reason why they ever have to know that they were a child with dyslexia. And that's my goal, is that all these, we've really done our job if kids are reading and they don't know they had problems, or they just think they've got some organizational issues and they're done. So let's take a real quick look at what effective intervention looks like. And I see we're running out of time, so I'm going to speed it up here. Interventions, and there isn't just one, so I want to be very clear about that. I can tell you, the interventions that we've used that were highly effective, but that's not to say that there aren't others. There are some very good things that are out there commercially. The most important thing is that the interventions do the things that are listed here, and that they are being taught by teachers who really have deep knowledge and skill in how to teach these things. So we want to make sure that children are being taught to be sensitive to the sounds that they're hearing in words, that they're being taught how these sounds map onto printed words, that this work continues beyond the single syllable, and that children understand how all the 6 syllables, really 7 if you consider irregulars, or the schwas, the syllable types, and that we take this work into multisyllabic words. And I see that as a real problem. Our interventions often only take children through to that very first level and don't continue on into morphographic knowledge and things. That we move quickly from teaching letter sound recognition into word building, that as soon as children have a consonant and a vowel that can be built into words, we're word building and not just working on letter sounds. I've seen interventions that spend too much time learning all the sounds and not working on words quickly enough. You can be working on letters, that letter sound recognition, and word building simultaneously. That we want interventions that are bringing the vocabulary and comprehension work in from the beginning. If your intervention is working on fluency, the kids are going to be in better shape. And fluency in the early days is fluency at the letter sound level, doing every task a little faster. We also, interventions that include spelling in service to word recognition are more powerful. And so they're being asked to spell what they hear and spell it correctly. And also interventions that have children writing in service to comprehension have better outcomes. So those are things, just as a real quick list of things to look for in the interventions, or maybe supplementing an intervention that you're using that's working well. We do know that it's probably smart to adopt an intervention that has proven efficacy, meaning that there's been randomized controlled trials done on it. There are a number of those. And so again, I'm not wanting to identify the one, but before you go and adopt an intervention, make sure that there's really been some scientific work done with kids that are at least struggling readers. They may not be identified specifically as dyslexic, but should have been done with kids that have serious reading struggles. And we also know that it's not necessary that it be done one-on-one. but actually there seems to be some power in small groups, but small groups of about 3 seems to be the ideal number. So small groups that are 6, 7, 8 kids, that's too big for these kids. And we think that one-on-one actually maybe puts too much pressure on kids. So I was surprised to learn that small groups of about 3 seem to be about ideal. It also is important to know that we can identify these kids, and you don't have to do a brain scan, that typical assessments that we do in our schools right now, so like the assessments that the woman identified that were being done in her state for dyslexia, are accurate. So here you see a list of assessments, the kind of things that you want to do in pre-kindergarten and kindergarten. And what's different in first grade is that you really want to know that they're learning letter sounds in addition to letter names. Rapid naming, of course, they're mostly the same. And if they aren't reading any words at all in first grade, that's also a pretty big indicator. The last thing is that we really need teachers and administrators and the dyslexia specialists working together. And often that means that teachers, especially in the general education, or if you've got a dyslexia teacher who's new to teaching kids with dyslexia, or just, you know, you've got a challenging munch, that we know that these teachers need support. And of course, I'm going to put in a plug for Hoot here, because Hoot is designed specifically to provide technology that allows us to provide coaching, putting teachers onto teams of the community and of other teachers and personalizing their learning. So we know that teachers need support for every child, and for our kids with dyslexia, it becomes intensely important that we help, especially these general education teachers, understand what our kids need. It turns out all kids benefit, and that differentiation, which is so hard to do when you've got a whole classroom full of kids. And so we've really spent a lot of time figuring out how to support teachers with our Hoot technology. The last thing I want to share with you is that the IDA has a number of really good resources that you may or may not be aware of, but all of these are available on the IDA website. And so, especially for those of you who are sharing things with general educators or parents, everything you need in terms of what we know is best practices and the knowledge and practice standards for teachers are all listed here on the IDA resources. And that actually is our talk today. I would direct you to the IDA website for lots of other good information. And if you're interested in knowing more about what the Hoot Education platform does, we've been using that technology today to do this webinar. And I thank you so much for your participation today. We do have a list of questions, so I will try to answer those in text form. And this webinar will be posted in the next few days at the Dyslexia IDA organization at the, on their website, and as well as the Hoot Education website. Thank you for your participation today.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the portion with Dr. Mathis. As a follow-up, we will be posting, as Patricia mentioned, on the IDA website as well as Hoot Education. There will be a link to the video presentation as well as the slide deck so that you can take a look at those and reference them if you're working with your districts or people in your community. Once again, thanks for your participation. Have a good afternoon.